Hello, I'm Christine Katerba, and I'm a pediatric neuropsychologist at Nationwide Children's Hospital in Columbus, Ohio. And today we're going to be talking about collateral information in neuropsychological evaluations. So, first of all, what is collateral information, and how do we go about using this as part of our neuropsychological evaluation? So, collateral information is really any information that does not come directly from the patient themselves. So, examples of this could be interviews that you might do with the caregiver or family members, a teacher, maybe a spouse of the patient. So, you're gathering information during an interview to learn more about the patient. This could also be rating forms that you collect from the caregiver, maybe a parent or a spouse or a close friend that gives you some more information about the patient in a more standardized format. And then you could also have teacher or employer rating forms as well. So basically, these are all ways of gathering extra information outside of your interactions with the patient themselves that are telling you more about the patient. Now, why is this important? So when you're working with a child or with an adult, you might only have a few hours to get to know them and assess them and really get a sense of where their abilities are and what they are like as a person. I often will tell parents when I'm working with children, I'll say, we are only going to have your child here for a few hours today. And we get to see what they're like in this very controlled environment. But I really want to get a sense from you what they're like every day of their lives. You know them better than anyone else. And I want to know what they're like at home, what they might be like in school, or for an adult, what they might be like at work. Sometimes when I ask for teacher rating forms, parents will say, well, what teachers do you want them from? And I usually like to get rating forms from a class that they love, maybe a subject they're really good in, or a teacher they really like. And then I like to get the opposite of that. So I like to get rating forms from maybe a class that's really hard for them, or maybe a teacher that they don't get along with so well. Because I want to get an impression of what they're like in settings where they might be doing really well and what they're like in settings that are much harder for them. And then I like to find out what tasks are they able to complete easily? Where do they need more support? And if you think about the work that you're doing with the patient directly, they may or may not be able to answer some of these questions, especially if we're worried about things like insight and awareness. They might not be able to tell you the things that are hard for them. They might just think everything is really easy for them. So it's important to get the full picture of the person as a whole rather than just looking at their test score performance. And as you've probably been learning throughout this whole Enigma series, neuropsychological evaluations are so much more than just looking simply at test scores. And collateral information is a really good example of a way that we can get information about the person as a whole to form a really valuable and rich conceptualization of them, and then be able to make recommendations that are going to be the most useful. And that brings up another really important point. When we're developing recommendations, we want to know the settings where a person is really struggling, so that we can develop recommendations or accommodations or support that can help them to be most successful. So, how can we get collateral information? Well, one great way is just through interviews. Working with children, I always start with a caregiver interview with maybe a parent or a guardian or maybe an extended family member. Sometimes there might be multiple caregivers in that interview. And I ask a lot of questions about what the child's background is like, what their current functioning is like, how things are going in school, basically information that isn't readily available in a medical record or through the patient interview. Sometimes I also am contacting teachers too to find out more about what the child is like in school, especially if it seems like they're having more difficulties in school than they might be having at home. And you might want to get information from other important figures in a person's life. And this is where you might get a little bit more creative with an adult because they might not have a direct caregiver or a teacher who you can contact. So you might need to look to other people who are close and who know them very well. Outside of interviews, you can collect standardized rating forms. So these can look at things like emotional and behavioral functioning, things like symptoms of anxiety, depression, withdrawal, maybe hyperactivity, externalizing behaviors like aggression, conduct disorder symptoms, or oppositional and defiant behaviors. You can also look at things like attention and impulsivity as well. And some rating forms also, in addition to emotional and behavioral ratings, include some measures of adaptive functioning and academic skills and intelligence. You could also get rating forms that are specifically geared towards functions like attention and executive functions. For individuals who may be lower functioning, getting a measure of daily living skills or adaptive functioning can also be really valuable. And working with children, sometimes I give a paper and pencil questionnaire to families that looks at adaptive functioning. But other times I find that a standardized interview of adaptive functioning might be more helpful. And for those of you working with special populations, you might have other rating forms that you like to use as well. So sometimes it's not so important how we're getting the information. What really is important, and what you'll see through some examples, is that we are getting that information. So how does this all fit with a typical evaluation? So just to kind of refresh your memory, or if you're not super familiar with how neuropsychological evaluations work, I wanted to walk you through some of the steps. So typically we start with an intake interview. So this is with caregivers, family, spouse, and an interview with the patient as well. And during this interview, we're taking into account the referral question. We're thinking about who made the referral. And we're really trying to find out more about what the key stakeholders involved in this person's life are looking to get out of this evaluation. If it's a child, are we looking to determine the impact of their medical condition in maybe making a diagnosis of intellectual disability? If it's an adult, are we looking to assess whether their cognitive functioning has declined and whether there might be signs of dementia or cognitive impairment? So then we do our testing and make a lot of behavioral observations. And I find sometimes the behavioral observations can be even more important than the test results themselves in telling you about how the child is functioning. But we use both of those things together to really form our conceptualization. And you can see here an important step is getting those collateral rating forms, getting as much information as possible from the child or the adult and from people in their lives. Then we score everything, interpret the results, and we use that information along with the clinical interview and the medical history. And part of those scores that are coming in are also those collateral rating forms. Next, we form a conceptualization that includes all of this information, all the information from the person on the date of testing, but then as much information as we can get about how they function on any given day as well. Then we integrate all of this information into the finalized report. And a step that I like to take as well, and I think a lot of us as neuropsychologists really prioritize, is a feedback session with the key stakeholders that are important in this person's life. And something that I like to do during this feedback session is I like to discuss these results with the family or the caregivers or the loved ones. And I say, how does this fit with what you see? And most of the time, my test results do fit very well with the impressions that the family has of their loved one. But as you're going to see in some examples, that doesn't always happen. Example one I wanted to give is a 13-year-old who comes to testing very tired. They're yawning throughout the evaluation. They said they didn't sleep very well the night before. And on testing, they perform well below average in all areas. Now, during the parent and teacher interview, you find the child is struggling with reading and attention, but is otherwise at grade level in all other areas. They're getting A's in math and D's in reading. They have trouble focusing and attending on homework at home and school, but with support, they are able to complete work. On parent and teacher rating forms, they reported elevated attention problems, elevated executive functioning problems, but they reported that otherwise this person is doing quite well in all other areas. During the feedback, parents were surprised about the patient's performance, and they noted too that he was very tired that week after staying up really late playing video games. They also reported that he's done well on statewide testing with the exception of reading. So what are the conclusions here? Well, without collateral information, I might think the patient is performing well below grade and age level, they need significant support, they might actually meet criteria for a diagnosis of intellectual disability. And for those of you who are not familiar with this term, intellectual disability is the newer label that we use for mental retardation. Now, this is a very significant diagnosis and one that can really impact the child throughout the rest of their life. So it carries a lot of weight, and it's very important that we're considering all pieces of information when considering making this diagnosis. Now, with collateral information, all my results are quite different. The test results suggest that he was below average in all areas, but the parent and teacher report didn't match that. It could be that fatigue was driving his low performance on that day of testing, or it could be that there were other factors that we didn't account for. So again, it's really important to look at the child as a whole when we're forming our conclusions. Example 2 here. An 8-year-old patient comes in for testing with concerns related to attention, learning difficulties, and executive functioning difficulties. We completed testing in a structured one-on-one environment with lots of prompts and redirection, and they actually performed in the average range in all areas. Now, during the parent and teacher interview, we learned that in the classroom and at home, this child had significant difficulties paying attention, staying on task, completing work on his own, and ignoring distractors. He gets stuck on certain topics and ideas and has trouble shifting his attention. He does much better with structure, routine, and one-on-one work versus working independently or in a larger group. When we looked at parent and teacher rating forms, we found significant elevations on measures of attention, hyperactivity, impulsivity, and executive functions, along with relative difficulties with learning and academic performance. So we're getting a pretty different picture here when we compare our testing to what's going on day to day. Without collateral information, we might conclude this patient is average in all areas, no areas of difficulty, and they're doing very well, no diagnoses to be made. But with collateral information, we might interpret these results to say this patient does well in a structured one-on-one setting with a high level of support, clear expectations, and when they're motivated to perform well. We might also conclude that this patient meets criteria for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder with elevated symptoms in 2 settings. So thinking of these 2 examples, we can form very different conclusions when we look at the collateral information in addition to our standardized test results. Now, of course, there are some challenges that can make getting collateral information really, really tricky. Let's say you're testing someone during the summer or maybe at the very beginning of the school year. So there's really no teacher ratings that are available. Teachers can be understandably hard to track down in the summer, and it might be that it's been a few months since they've even seen this student. Maybe you provided the rating forms, but they were never returned, or they were returned only partially completed. So you're not able to score them up and get those full kind of standardized ratings. Maybe the family speaks a language other than English and there's no rating forms that are available. And this happens to us a lot of the time working with a very diverse population, is that we have rating forms available in English, but we don't have these translated into a whole lot of other languages. The other thing that can be challenging too is the family may speak English, but they may not be able to read proficiently enough to complete the rating form. Sometimes what we see is that a child is in the custody of Children's Protective Services and there aren't any caregivers available that really know the child enough to be able to answer these rating forms. And then with adults, they might not have anyone else in their lives who could complete these rating forms. So while very important, it can be extremely challenging to get this information. So a couple main takeaway points here. Try to get as much collateral information as possible, and also document when you have tried to get it but have not been successful. If someone is reading your report and they're wondering, I wonder what the parent or the employer might say, it can be really helpful to see a note that says, rating forms were provided, but they were not returned at the time of this evaluation. Or we attempted to get rating forms, but we're not able to reach someone who knew the person well enough to fill them out. And even if standardized rating forms are not available, attempt to get information from multiple people who know the person in order to form a full picture in your conceptualization. And this can be done through an interview, maybe even a phone call when you get assigned release to reach out to some people in the person's life. So thank you so much for joining me today to learn about collateral information in neuropsychological evaluations and reports. Again, my name is Christine Katurba, and I'm a pediatric neuropsychologist at Nationwide Children's Hospital. I included my contact information here. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out. Thank you.